Let's talk about value and how possibly efficiency could become the enemy of value. What am I talking about? Well, there's a little bit of a hidden risk here, particularly where AI is concerned. So let's unpack that a little bit because the enemy of value I'm referring to is because we are certainly in a moment, if not entering a moment, that feels on the surface like huge progress. Faster systems, leaner teams, smarter tools. But if I'm honest, we might be optimizing in the wrong direction. The conversation around AI in business, it's certainly dominated by one big idea, and that's efficiency. We hear a lot about cost reduction, about headcount savings. Productivity gains, they're all valid, of course, necessary even, but potentially incomplete and maybe a little dangerous. If you spend enough time in boardrooms right now, you start to notice a pattern. Most organizations are operating in two modes: reduce costs, avoid risks. And that's pretty much it. Now, innovation exists, but often at the margins. Marketing, occasionally celebrated, but I would offer rarely understood at its full potential. Now, I was reading recently some work by Rory Sutherland, and in his 2026 predictions, I think he articulates this tension very well. Businesses, Rory suggests, are becoming increasingly obsessed with efficiency to the point where they're actually risking stripping out the very things that are creating value in the first place. AI, for all its promise, it's being positioned as the ultimate efficiency machine. And maybe that should give us pause. There's a concept described that many of you may have seen play out time and time again. And Rory gives a great example about, or something I think he loosely calls it the Doorman fallacy. You define a role narrowly, you reduce it to its most measurable function, and then you replace it. So a hotel doorman is someone who opens the door. So you install an automatic door, cost saved, efficiency improved. But what disappears is the greeting, the recognition of regular guests, the subtle signal of quality, the human touch that shapes perception long before the room is even seen. None of that will show up in a spreadsheet, and so none of it will be defended. And we're seeing the same pattern everywhere, aren't we? Self checkout in retail environments, chatbots in customer service, automated workflows in marketing, AI generated content replacing creative exploration. Each one justifiable in isolation, each one logical, but collectively, you could risk eroding something harder to measure, something slower to reveal itself: value. One of the most uncomfortable truths in marketing is that the things that matter are often the hardest to quantify: trust, experience, emotion, memory. Rory Sutherland, he goes on to explain an example about the Royal Mail, huge postal service that I think is familiar to many. And operational improvements in delivery reliability had little to no impact at all on the brand's perception. What actually mattered was whether the customers liked their postman or not. And if you think about that for a second, years and years of investments in systems and logistics all showed up as minimal brand impact. A friendly human interaction, outsized influence. Now, it's very tempting, I suppose, to just dismiss this as anecdotal, but I don't think it is. I think it's structural. We've built business systems that reward what's easier to measure, not necessarily what is important. AI, it fits perfectly into the system because it produces outputs that are immediate, trackable, scalable, and it tells a much cleaner story. We reduce costs by 18%. We increase productivity by 30%. We automated 60% of our customer interactions. They might all be true. They're certainly all impressive, but there's an uncomfortable question, isn't there? What did we lose? And the real risk of AI isn't that it replaces humans, it's that it replaces the wrong parts of the human experience. And also, we probably won't notice that immediately because the negative effects have a tendency to show up later on in slower growth, in a weaker brand affinity, in declining loyalty, in things that don't fit neatly into quarterly reporting. There's another point that I think is even more provocative, and that's the argument that businesses tend to treat themselves as efficiency mechanisms, but they should probably treat themselves more or behave more like discovery mechanisms. And I think that's a distinction that certainly matters. An efficiency driven business will ask the question, how do we do the same thing cheaper? A discovery driven business would ask, what new value can we create? And AI can serve both models, but right now, overwhelmingly, it is being deployed in the service of the first. And that's a strategic choice, whether we acknowledge it or not. Now, you may also have seen this play out in digital transformation programs over the past, I don't know, decade or more. Phase one, it's always the same: automate, streamline, reduce friction. Phase two, if it comes at all, is where things get interesting because using technology to enhance the experience, to create differentiation, to unlock new forms of value. And then there's a third phase, which very few organizations typically reach, and that's called reinvention. There's an analogy of the electric motor that Rory uses, and he talks about early adopters simply replacing steam engines with electric ones, minimal gains. It was only when factories redesigned their entire system around the new technology that the real benefits emerged. We are right now firmly in phase one of AI, which means most of the real opportunity, it's still ahead. There's something else worth saying, even if it feels a little strange, and that is that different is often more valuable than better. What do I mean by that? Well, in a world where AI is driving to some degree standardization, where processes are all optimized and outputs become homogenized, differentiation becomes much rarer and therefore more valuable. If every company automates customer service, the company that invests in exceptional human interaction probably stands out. If every brand produces AI generated content, the brand that creates something unexpected, imperfect, or otherwise probably gets more human attention. Not because it is objectively better, but because it is meaningfully different. And this creates an interesting strategic tension, if you like, because do you follow the efficiency curve or do you deliberately step away from it? There's no single right answer here. I suspect that most successful companies have to do both. You use AI to remove friction where it doesn't matter, and you invest more deeply in human experiences where it does. The challenge, of course, is knowing the difference. And another idea that stayed with me is this: the real value of marketing isn't what we do, it's how we think. And that might sound a little abstract, but it's incredibly practical. Marketers are trained at their best to see the world from the customer's perspective, to understand perception, not just reality, to recognize that behavior is not always rational. Remove that perspective from decision making, and organizations start to make technically correct but fundamentally flawed choices. We've all seen it. Processes that make sense internally but frustrate customers. Systems optimized for cost but not for experience, and products designed for efficiency rather than desirability. None of those decisions are irrational, they are simply incomplete. AI, in many ways, may amplify this risk because it operates on data, on patterns, on what has worked before. It is by design a tool for optimization. But growth rarely comes from optimization alone. It comes from rethinking assumptions, from exploring adjacent possibilities, from doing something that doesn't yet fit the model. That's where human judgment at this moment in time still really matters. Not as a counter to AI, that's not what I'm saying, but as a complement to it. So where does this leave us? Well, I don't think the answer is to slow down on AI adoption at all. That I think is unrealistic and frankly extremely unwise. The opportunity it's too significant at this stage. But I do think we need to be more intentional about how we deploy it. Not just asking, can we automate this, but also maybe asking, should we? And perhaps more importantly, what are we optimizing for? Because if we're not careful, we could end up in a world where everything works perfectly and nothing feels special anymore, where every interaction is efficient, but nothing is memorable. Where the cost is lower, but so is the perceived value. And I think if businesses are looking to come out of the next number of years or possibly the next decade on top, they probably aren't going to be the people that use AI the most aggressively. They're probably going to be the ones that use it more thoughtfully, the ones that understand where efficiency creates value and where it quietly destroys it. The ones that remember that behind every metric is normally a human being making a judgment, and that judgment is rarely as rational as we'd like to believe. So, look, if I've got to leave one point here at this stage, it's this: AI will make it easier than ever to do things right. The real challenge will be in making sure we're still doing the right things.